Welcome everyone. I'm Martin Hegel, and this is the second of our Frankie lectures, which have been made possible by the generosity of Richard and Barbara Frankie. Gary introduced the whole series last time, so I won't go over all that again. But just to have a sense of the format, the speaker who comes today, Professor Robert Pippin, is sitting in on the Frankie seminar and then giving a lecture and then having dinner with the students. So it's a really exciting format for everyone involved. And it's a particularly great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Robert Pippin to Yale. Pippin is the Evelyn Stefansson Distinguished Service Professor of Social Thought and Philosophy at the University of Chicago. And given that he by now is the author of some 15 books, just reading the titles will take most of the time I have for this introduction. So what I want to do instead is just give a very synoptic account of Pippin's importance for contemporary work in the humanities, while mentioning only a few of his many influential books, which range from philosophy to literature and art, all the way to Hollywood westerns and film noir. So at the heart of Pippin's work stands a book from 1989 entitled Hegel's Idealism. And I think it's extremely rare for a work of secondary literature and philosophy to have the kind of transformative effect and enduring legacy that Pippin's book has had, both in Anglo-American philosophy and in Germany. What Pippin did in that first book was that he powerfully refuted the idea that Hegel is some sort of pre-critical and totalizing metaphysician, instead showing why Hegel may be the most sophisticated of all post-Kantian philosophers up until the present. And this is a perspective that Pippin has continued to develop through Hegelian engagements with philosophers such as Nietzsche, Adorno, and Heidegger, as well as in his book on Hegel's practical philosophy, which not only reconstructs Hegel's dialectical notion of freedom, but also shows why this notion of freedom offers profound challenges to many contemporary philosophical paradigms. So not just the historical relevance of Hegel, but the contemporary philosophical relevance of Hegel, in the way it allows us to challenge, for example, naturalist accounts of action or moral individualism. Now, all this would be impressive enough in itself, but Pippin has also pursued his dialectical logic of action in sophisticated engagements with authors such as Henry James and Marcel Proust, as well as through readings of modern art. So one can say then that Pippin never forgets the interdisciplinary and historical vocation of philosophy, thus remaining true to Hegel's dictum that philosophy should be its own time comprehended in thought. However, what I think is even more remarkable is that Pippin does not choose between an emphasis on the practical, social, and historical constitution of agency on the one hand, and Hegel's logical, metaphysical ambitions on the other. On the contrary, as Pippin has made clear in his recent work on the science of logic, if we understand Hegel's claim that logic is metaphysics in the right way, we will understand why it is crucial for grasping why historicity and sociality are essential and irreducible. It would be a mistake to call Hegel's concerns in the logic abstract. Rather, they concern the most general conditions of sense-making, and thereby they have concrete implications for our understanding of everything we do and everything we are. Now, I can testify firsthand to the sort of excitement that is generated when one begins to understand this claim. For the past 3 years, some of us here at Yale have been reading The Science of Logic systematically, and Pippin's new essay on the science of logic have accompanied us as we have done so. Indeed, during these 3 years, I've often had students coming to my office declaring that, oh, Pippin just published a new essay on the logic, with the same kind of excitement that you would declare that your favorite band just released a new song. And happily, I can declare that the album is now about to be released, and it has a great title, Hegel's Realm of Shadows. Come to think of it, that would be a great name of a rock band. Hegel's Realm of Shadows. It would sell out stadiums. Pippin may not be selling out stadiums, even though I think he should, but he's one of the most vital and important thinkers alive, so I'm very excited to welcome him here to Yale.
Thank you very much. This is the second time I've had the pleasure of Martin's informed and complimentary introductions. I wish I could just record them and take them with me. It's very kind of you to invite me. I do feel I should perhaps apologize a little bit for this lecture. When I got the invitation, I heard that there was this Frankie seminar and that they were discussing Heidegger's Being and Time. And I know that Martin's interpretation of Heidegger is very much, I would call a Hegelian interpretation of Heidegger. I thought I would read something on Heidegger's criticism of Hegel, which is what this paper is. My compulsion to apologize is that it will sound, although I agree with Martin it isn't, but it will certainly sound excessively abstract, just by virtue of who Hegel and Heidegger are. They don't write in a way that is easily accessible, and I will do everything I can to make the abstractions of both of them accessible. But I feel humbled by the task, and I hope I've made clear what's at stake between them, because I think it bears quite a lot on the kinds of things I heard discussed this afternoon in the seminar. The project from which this paper is drawn is a philosophical engagement with the tradition of anti-Hegelianism in modern European thought. A critique which I want to show amounts to an attack on what I consider Hegel's version of idealism, and ultimately on systematic philosophy as traditionally understood, which Hegel is thought by many people to have brought to some sort of conclusion. Idealism in this tradition should not be understood as a claim about the mind dependence of the world, or about mind-imposed structure and experience, or as a so-called objective idealism, a claim about the non-material nature of the real in favor of its ideal nature, but first and foremost as an objection to empiricism, the claim that all knowledge is or must be based on empirical experience, itself paradoxically an a priori claim. By contrast, idealism in Kant, Fichte, and Hegel is a claim about the capacity of pure, empirically unaided human reason to determine of all that is knowable, that it is knowable, and how it is knowable. Since this amounts to a claim about the normative authority of knowledge claims, by what right we claim what we claim to know, and since it is reason alone that can demonstrate such normative authority, this must mean that human reason is to be understood in a way that begins the paradox that is Hegel, to be self-authorizing, a tribunal unto itself. In the Hegelian version, this determination of the knowable is a determination of all that there is in its knowability, and so is in metaphysics. The determination of the knowable is not for Hegel the determination of a limitation, as if a limitation just to the knowable for us. Or in Hegel's famous and controversial phrase, this determination, this self-determination by reason of its own requirements, is absolute. And so is, as he constantly says, a determination of the absolute, of all that is in its knowability, that is, of all that is. In other words, idealism in this sense invokes the deepest principle of all Western rationalism. To be is to be rationally intelligible. There can be nothing alogos, or unintelligible. Obviously, this all rests everything of significance on the determination of the necessary requirements of intelligibility, what Hegel called a logic, and why we should think that such a determination sets out what Kant, in another context, called not merely the logically possible, but the really possible. The position obviously does not hold that there is nothing unknown, but that there can be nothing in principle unknowable, that the logic of the form of the knowable can be fully determined. This then would clearly amount to a claim about the conceptual structure or logic of what there is. As is well known, many of the most influential figures in this period, roughly 1807 until the present in European philosophy, considered Hegel their chief opponent, an animus also shared by the likes of Schelling, Kierkegaard, Marx, Heidegger, Adorno, Derrida, Deleuze, Bataille, Foucault, Lyotard, and Levinas. So there's some sort of strange Freudian moment in which Hegel is the big daddy who has to be killed before philosophy can begin again. And that dimension I'm not going to talk about, but it's not really supplanting your predecessor, a position well known here at Yale, but killing him off once and for all for good. And they often explicitly did so, attack Hegel, by identifying him as the epitome or culmination of all Western philosophy itself. The dispute, in one way or another, concerns an attack on that idealist claim for the autonomy and self-sufficiency and self-authorizing character of rational reflection, and especially against Hegel's claim for the absolute status of the results, all in favor of various versions of the finitude or limitation of human reflection. Now, these interpretations often draw large implications from what I believe to be a distorted interpretation of Hegel. However, the proposal tonight is not that all of modern continental philosophy rests on a mistaken interpretation of Hegel. Many other issues were certainly in play, but the contestation between idealism and anti-idealism, between the self-sufficiency of reason and its putative radical finitude, is of major philosophical importance in itself. There is a way of genuinely understanding Hegel such that this long critical reaction certainly has some real grip on a real problem in Hegel. In other words, while it's true that the received Hegel interpretation is, for me, largely inaccurate, pointing this out hardly settles the issue. The central challenge to idealism, which I'll sketch below, is still a very powerful one. The basic claim in this long tradition about the insufficiency of idealism or pure thinking, or even systematic philosophy, is important enough to warrant that kind of interrogation. My suggestion will be that Hegel's potential contribution to this discussion has been both misunderstood and undervalued, and the central claim is that when the ambitions of what Hegel called pure thinking are properly identified, the criticisms embodied in the finitist argument that I want to identify, while interesting and important, don't hold. But first I have to proceed to a ridiculously brief summation of the Hegelian ambition itself. So here goes. The central idealist claim began with Kant's critique of pure reason and his assumption that reason was capable of determining what it was entitled to claim, and capable also of restricting itself when it could not provide such authority. The first critique is itself an exercise of pure reason, exercised on itself. This almost immediately generated the concern that such an enterprise would not only end in a destructive, self-devouring skepticism, but in an all-destructive nihilism, Jacobi's original coinage, leaving nothing of moral substance or objective status standing. But a deeper and more long-standing issue arose in the thought of Hegel, especially in his attempt in his major theoretical work, The Science of Logic, a book that has not until very recently, to say the least, enjoyed much of a reception in either Anglophone or European philosophy. The issue of that book looks like this. Hegel's claim has three components. The first is the claim that a priori knowledge of the world, the ordinary spatio-temporal world, is possible, a priori knowledge of the world, knowledge about that world, but achieved independently of empirical experience. Obviously, Hegel does not mean knowledge of how cholesterol is produced or what caused the extinction of dinosaurs, but knowledge of the right understanding of the substance-property relation, the form-matter relation, essence-appearance relation, universality and particularity relation, and so forth. The second component is where all the controversies begin. It is the claim that this a priori knowledge, while in some sense to be specified ultimately about the world, consists in thinking or reason's knowledge of itself, thinking's determination of thinking, or as Hegel designates it, a science of pure thinking. This is what distinguishes classical rationalism from post-Kantian idealism, as Hegel understands it. The former holds that reason has access to its proper objects outside itself, non-sensible entities, monads, res cogitans, Platonic ideas. The latter, that the object of pure thinking is only itself. But there is clearly a question to be asked. How could the first two components, a priori knowledge of being, and pure thinking's object, being itself, possibly be jointly true? One long dominant interpretation of Hegel on this point, the third component, and the putative resolution of this tension between the first two, holds that these two claims can both be assertable only if what there really is, the really real world, what is accessible only to pure reason alone, is itself something like thought, thinking moments, perhaps something like the absolutes or God's thinking itself, an inherent evolving noetic structure unfolding in time from the human perspective, Spinoza-like absolute in itself. Pure thought thinking itself is the manifestation of the noesis noesios, God thinking himself, or it is the divine-like apprehension of a noetic reality that underlies experienced appearances. That would certainly resolve the tension. I can't do so here, but I've argued for many years that this interpretation does not at all fit the text. So an alternate interpretation is necessary, and I'll discuss that in a moment. But apart from the interpretation issue, the various critiques I am interested in all hold that any such project is doomed from the start, that there is not and cannot be such self-sufficient, pure thinking. Another way of saying that there isn't such a thing as philosophy, traditionally understood. Philosophy is a non-empirical enterprise. It's pure thinking. It's an attempt to determine an answer to questions like what is art, what is religion, what is the good life, non-empirically, purely. So an attack on pure thinking is ultimately an attack on the possibility of philosophy. I noted that such a broad counterclaim is often summarized as a doctrine of radical finitude. This is an apt title, since Hegel insists that, to use an Aristotelian formulation, thinking is not the thinking of any object. And when he wants to summarize such an unusual reflective self-relation, he notes what he calls the infinity of thinking's relation to itself. He means, pure thinking's object is itself, but not as an object or event. Rather, its object is the thinking also interrogating thinking, a circle, not a dyadic relation, hence the provocative notion of infinity, without beginning or end, subject or object. The criticism holds that thinking must always be understood as grounded on or dependent on or an epiphenomenon of some sort of non-thinking ground or absolute or materiality or contingency or the unconscious instinct or drive of the thinker. Schelling's early formulation is apt. The distinction between thinking and what is other than thinking, between subject and object, cannot itself either be a subjective or an objective distinction. If it were either, there would actually be no distinction. So what there really is can be characterized neither as absolute subject nor absolute object, but here the difficulties with Schelling begin, somehow the neither subject nor object. Hegel's prioritization of the concept, in his terms the identification of the absolute as the concept, intelligibility itself, is said to be by Schelling a prioritization of absolute subjectivity, and so to require only one relation to what is other than thought, nature, pure domination, Herrschaft. It would be hard to overstate the influence of such an argument. The details vary a great deal, of course, but the form of skepticism remains, from Schelling to Heidegger to Adorno especially. But the counter-argument I want to defend is that Hegel's treatment, the topic of pure thinking, has nothing to do with the thinker, the subject, consciousness, the mind. The topic rather raises as a problem the possibility of the intelligibility of even whatever is being touted as preconscious source or hidden origin. The intelligibility of what is assumed in any such determinate identification as a knowledge claim, even of the so-called neither subject nor object. That must still, in the most general sense, make sense within some general regime of sense-making, or nothing has been claimed. An empty space in logical space would have just been suggested. Any such criticism, insofar as it is a thinking, a judging, a claim to know, is always already a manifestation of a dependence on pure thinking and its conditions. And such moments of pure thinking are to delimit, but not limit, the normative domain of intelligibility, what can rightly be distinguished from what, or rightly posited as ground, for example, and not any process or series of events that goes on in supposed independence of the empirical world. Pure thinking, as Hegel understands it, is neither dependent on nor independent of the empirical or materiality or the brain or the indifference point or whatever new absolute comes into fashion. His position would be better understood, at least at first, by rough analogy with Frege or Wittgenstein of the Tractatus or the early Husserl on logic as metaphysics. That anti-Hegelian question already manifests for the Hegelian a misunderstanding of the question of pure thinking itself. This is not to deny that any reference to thinking presumes a thinker, indeed a living, purposive, finite, embodied, rational thinker. Hegel addresses that issue in his philosophy of subjective spirit, his phenomenology, and elsewhere. It is rather to argue for the autonomy of the question of any thinking at all, whatever the existential status of the thinker. That is, it is to insist on the priority and autonomy of what Hegel called logic, and that means for him a complete self-determination of its own moments. Hegel's enterprise in the logic takes as its topic the categories, or thought determinations, necessary for thought to have determinate objective content, an enterprise that at the same time specifies the determinations inherent in the possible determinacy of any being itself. It is true that it would seem that Hegel is subject to his own criticism, that pure thinking must already assume a determination of what pure thinking amounts to. But Hegel's innovation here, derived partly from Fichte, and one of the hardest aspects of his thought, so I'm sorry about this, is that pure thinking comes to self-consciousness about itself just by thinking, in the sense that one understands what it is to believe by believing, what it is to act by acting, not by means of any self-observation. I mean something here simpler than it sounds. When you are doing something, you know what you're doing by doing it. You don't know what you're doing by doing it and observing yourself doing it. When you want to know what you believe, you attempt to figure out what you believe. You don't intend to inspect your beliefs. You're trying to figure out, what do I believe? You end up believing what you believe by believing it, and knowing what you believe by coming to believe it. Same with acting. Same with thinking. You know what it is to be thinking by thinking, not by inspecting yourself thinking. That's essentially the method of the logic. But I don't pretend it's immediately pellucid. Put a different way, it's how Hegel wants to get out of this paradox, that a science of pure thinking would already be pure thinking. That's captured in this paradox of infinity, of not having a beginning and end. His response? Start thinking. Think being, which is the beginning of the logic. And you'll find thinking being can't be a thought. It must be determinately distinguishable from something it isn't to be a thought. Yeah, that's it. I say etc. as if everybody's familiar with the first moment of the logic, but you get the point, I hope. Put a different way, if Hegel were making a claim about the mind's thinking nature, how we must think about the world, knowledge would be limited by its instrument, something Hegel had been vigorously denying since the introduction to the phenomenology in 1807. In knowing itself, what pure thought knows is the possible intelligibility, the knowability of anything that is. But the intelligibility of anything is just what it is to be that thing, to be determinately this such, tota t, the answer to the what is it question, t esti, definitive of metaphysics since Aristotle. To be is to be intelligible, determinately what it is. So in knowing itself, thought knows of all things what it is to be anything. Again, for Aristotle, the task of metaphysics is not to say of any particular thing what it is. It is to determine what must be true of anything at all, such that what it is in the particular can be determined by the special sciences. Of course, the physics and the de anima are also philosophical sciences for Aristotle, although they're not first philosophy. But Hegel will also have a philosophy of nature and a philosophy of spirit, aside from the science of logic. But the analogy with such things as Frege's and Husserl's critique of psychologism only goes so far, not only because Hegel's account of how pure thinking determines the necessary moments of the intelligibility of anything at all, already a distinctive and unprecedented position, but also because it involves a further argument about the bearing of such results on the intelligibility of nature and human practices. This feature of Hegel's position, which is among these critics an understandable frustration, the relation between the logic and the philosophy of nature and spirit, touches on another major dimension of the anti-idealist critique, one most associated with Schelling, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger. It is that thought, paradigmatically Hegel's pure thinking, or even philosophy itself, as traditionally understood, cannot finally contribute to any understanding of, cannot in effect even reach, the most vital concrete issues faced in human life, existential issues. I mean, this is the traditional critique of all philosophy, that its abstractions can't help us with the problems we face as the concrete human beings we are. This is another implication in the critics of what they consider the finitude of thought. And it is argued more and more radical ways of addressing, illuminating, understanding in some way such existence issues are needed. Hegel certainly cannot contribute to this, goes the criticism, if Hegel is understood as he seems to require, interrogating the role of reason, some normative order, in the changing socio-political, religious, and artistic practices of an age. But again, this all depends on the proper understanding of what Hegel means by such an appeal to reason in such practices. And my claim is, or will be, that once the proper form of the structure of rationality or account-giving and justification in the logic is understood, its bearing on the issues Hegel himself brilliantly brought it to bear on, ethical life, art, religion, can finally be properly appreciated. I have a scholarly conscience, so I have to bore you with some quotations. I want to prove to you that Hegel is saying what I say he's saying, because what I'm now saying Hegel is saying, most people who work on Hegel do not believe Hegel is saying. So I have to now put some quotations on the board. Hurling Hegel quotations at you at 5:30 in the evening is not polite, but as I say, I do have a scholarly conscience. This is Hegel. I don't see how anybody can doubt what I'm saying, but they do, almost all of them. But this is what Hegel says. Thus, logic coincides with metaphysics, the science of things grasped in thoughts, which used to be taken to express the essentialities of things. He means the things outside used to be taken to be about things rather than pure thought. It's about things grasped in thoughts, which is the only way things can be intelligible as thought. We should note this change in emphasis by Hegel. The new metaphysics logic concerns things as grasped, gefasst, in thought, whereas the old metaphysics was a thing metaphysics, used to think of its subject matter as onto, outside itself, the essence of things. Or the objective logic, which are the first two books of the logic, thus takes the place, rather, of the former metaphysics, which was supposed to be the scientific edifice of the world, constructed by thoughts. The object of pure thinking is only pure thinking. Again, a logic alone takes the place of the former metaphysics. And finally, a longer quotation. The older metaphysics had in this respect a higher concept of thinking than now passes as the accepted opinion, which is that thinking is just a subjective activity, a psychological process. For it presupposed as its principle that only what is known of things and in things by thought is really true, wahrhaft wahre, in them. That is, what is known of them not in their immediacy, but as first elevated to the form of thinking, as things of thought. This metaphysics thus held that thinking and the determination of thinking are not something alien to subject matters, but rather their essence, or that the things and the thinking of them agree in and for themselves. It's not a correspondence view, in and for themselves. That thinking in its immanent determinations and the true nature of things are one and the same content. Not that thinking corresponds to things, but the determination by thinking of the requirements for any intelligibility by thinking is ipso facto a determination of the intelligibility of anything that could be, and thus an answer to the question, potentially, what is it? So, does this all put us in any better position to understand the skepticism from the finitude of thought objectors? Consider some of the most immediate pressing objections, which I'll turn now to. I'll have time to consider two objections, although at the level of abstraction and distance from various texts, I'll have to be subjective rather than definitive. But we have to start with an objection, again, as a matter of scholarly conscience, before we can even get started, from the Kantian camp, which rejects this whole enterprise. The second is from Schelling's point of view, and finally we'll conclude with Heidegger's response to all of this. Is it not obvious, says our Kant scholar, that any proposed identification of thought and being, like that asserted in the last quotation, simply ignores, rather than answers, the famous question that marked the beginning of critical philosophy for Kant in his famous to some of us, February 21st, 1772, letter to Marcus Hertz, This is the letter in which he claimed to have discovered, quote, the key to the whole secret of metaphysics, unquote, a question he said he had neglected in his 1770 dissertation. The question is, what is the ground of the relation of that in us, which we call representation, to an object? And, quote, the axioms of pure reason concerning these objects, how do they agree with these objects, since the agreement has not been reached with the aid of experience? Isn't Hegel, when all is said and done, a regression to uncritical thinking, dogmatism, rather than some sort of progress beyond Kant and his supposedly objectionable, subjective, mind-imposed unity, noumenal ignorance, idealism? It's absolutely correct to note that Hegel does not answer Kant's question, as much as reject it as confused and resting on its own dogmatic presuppositions. Part of that rejection is supported by what he thinks he accomplished in the Jena phenomenology of 1807, but it's also internal to the stance of the logic. First, such an objectionable presupposition is obvious when Kant had noted that pure concepts are that in us, which purport to be concepts of the real. Though, as Kant went on to say, quote, they must have their origin in the nature of the soul. They are neither caused by the object, nor do they bring the object itself into being, all creating for him the objectivity problem, a gap between thought and being, pure thought, pure thinking, empirically unaided thought, and being, that must be closed somehow. Hegel does not want to close it. He wants to reject the assumption. Now, Kant and Hegel certainly share what has been called the discursivity thesis. This means simply that thinking, what thinking is for both, is exclusively a spontaneous or productive power, in no sense a perceptual or passive receptive capacity. It would be very hard to exaggerate the magnitude of this common assumption in Kant and Hegel. More than anything else, it sounds the death knell of traditional rationalism, the light of reason available to the world. And it plays the crucial role at the decisive beginning of the logic, where Hegel demonstrates that mere being can be no actual thought at all. Its indeterminacy renders it a mere nothing, without some other, and that means some predicative determination other than the mere thought being for its determination. That's the discursivity thesis. Thought is an active, productive power, ultimately judgmental power, not a passive, intuitive power. Kant then reasoned that since the mind, and here his crucial failure for Hegel, since the mind is open or receptive to the world that we all know, the world around us now, only sensibly, and since thinking cannot create the objects it thinks, then thinking cannot provide itself with any content, can only be provided from content from without through sense experience. This would normally lead straight to empiricism, and probably an empirical skepticism too, but Kant believed he had discovered that there must be pure forms of sensible intuition, and this provided him a way, he thought, in the deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding, to connect the pure forms of thinking with pure forms of passive intuition, and thus get in view, as it were, a priori, all possible objects of experience, and argue for the validity of the categories for such objects. This, of course, had the effect of restricting those results for only possible objects of our sensible experience with our forms of intuition, thus initiating the Hegelian complaints about his subjective idealism. And Hegel had two main objections. First, Kant was hasty in arguing from the discursivity thesis to the claim that pure thinking can provide itself with no content. Kant himself had demonstrated that this was not so, since in what he called his metaphysical deduction, he had himself shown that pure thinking could give itself content, that is, its own necessary logical moments, the categorical features without which judging, could not be any sort of truth bearer. So we can return to the Hegelian claim. Pure thinking's proper object is itself. Hegel has no hesitation in saying several times that thought in the logic provides itself its own content, or produces its content, its own conceptual moments, eventually substance, property, form, matter, essence, appearance, concept, particular, and so forth. That there was a method for demonstrating that thinking itself must be thinking with these moments. For Hegel and for many after him, Kant himself didn't even attempt to show how this derivation was accomplished. He claimed misleadingly that he simply followed Aristotle's list that had been lying around for centuries, although that, of course, was not true. He essentially made it up. Moreover, Kant had realized that such forms of thought alone already provided what he called a clue, a Leitfaden, a guiding thread for the categories as forms of objects. So a link between the forms of thought and the forms of being was already in play for Kant. Second, Kant had already realized that the pure forms of thought were not just features of a human thinker, were not psychologically subjective, but necessary for any discursive thinker, whether human or not. Well, that just means any non-divine thinker. But since these forms of judgment are the forms of any possible truth-bearer, and since truth is either truth or not, it makes no sense to say that these forms delimit something like what is true for discursive thinkers. There's no such thing as truth, but just for X. The subjectivizing element in Kant are the species-specific pure forms of intuition, not the forms of thought. And once we reject the doctrine that there are such things as pure forms of intuition, as Hegel does, we can return to a position like Aristotle's, where we can in effect study being by studying the forms of predication. In Arya Kozman's fine phrase, quote, "Predication is nothing but the logical or discursive face of being," unquote. So Hegel thinks Kant had neglected his own achievements in the metaphysical deduction and in what Hegel humorously called Kant's fear of the object, unnecessarily subjectivized his results. It's Kant who is uncritical and dogmatic, not Hegel. Schelling's differences with what would become Hegel's position on logic as metaphysics are already apparent by implication in his early work. I assume many of you know that Schelling was slightly younger than Hegel, but much more famous in the early part of the 19th century, and brought Hegel to Jena as a kind of mentor, and was furious when the Phenomenology came out in 1807, and Hegel had put in a lot of clearly recognizable insults to his sponsor. Another killing the father issue, in this case killing the son. His 1797 Ideas Concerning a Philosophy of Nature, his 1800 System of Transcendental Idealism, he was already breaking for Hegel, the lectures he gave in 1802, 1803 on philosophy of art, and then finally his later explicit objections in lectures he gave in Munich in 1827 to the late 1830s called Lectures on Modern Philosophy. Issues are all very large and unwieldy, but they concern a basic conflict between a claim about what is always already presupposed and so forever unavailable for discursive articulation by pure thinking, versus a claim about the absolute, as we've introduced it, as always a result from which a ground can be retrospectively reconstructed and developed. But the specific claims are well known, however unwieldy these large issues are. There is first the issue of ground, some sort of ultimate source that would account for the difference between and yet also the identity between subjects, self-conscious thinkers and free agents, and objects, material but living productive nature. The difference in their positions implies that Hegel's position, said in the language of the period, which I hope has got a vague ring of intelligibility to it, that the absolute is the concept, does not resolve but simply avoids this issue of ground, the ground of the concept. Schelling thinks it's question-begging to consider it a concept. Second, a related issue is an objection to Hegel's philosophy of nature, that Hegel prioritizes the concept to nature, treating nature only in terms of its conceptual intelligibility, whereas the concept must be understood somehow to emerge from or always already depend on nature. And in the later lectures, the problem is existence for Schelling. Schelling's charge is that Hegel's program is never able to exit the realm of the merely conceptually possible. Hegelian philosophy can deal endlessly with what some possibility must be to be the possibility it is, but this has nothing to do with what there is, with the facticity that, as Schelling puts it, something exists. Hegel's results are locked up in the merely conceptually possible in what Schelling calls negative philosophy. Each of these objections is worthy of an independent study, but the outlines of Hegel's response involves the suggestion that some ineffable Ungrund, what Schelling, and a half joke called the ground as non-ground, because unavailable for determinate thought, because always presupposed. The objection is that does not even amount to a philosophical position. The language of the claim is well known from the preface to the Phenomenology, where Hegel, clearly referring to Schelling, who certainly noticed, is that all of this is an attempt to pass off, quote, its absolute as the night in which, as one says, all cows are black, unquote, which he calls, quote, an utterly vacuous naivete in cognition, unquote. One indeterminacy claimed as source is indistinguishable from any other possible candidate. If it is differentiable, a determinate position, then such a source has some sort of conceptual determinacy and falls inside the moments of the concept. That's why the concept is absolute. That which in principle falls outside the thinkable designates nothing at all. Such an Ungrund is an Unsinn, is nonsense. To be sure, Schelling has a lot to say about the role of art in somehow manifesting this discursively unmanifestable ground. But I don't believe it affects the basic determinacy point. The ineffable remains simply ineffable. But there is a deeper and more important point behind Schelling's concern. As he would put it, if there are both subjects and objects, thinkers and things they think about, then ultimately they still have incompatible properties. So how is it possible that pure thinking self-determination could somehow help us understand how that could be? Unless we are metaphysical dualists, and Hegel certainly isn't it obvious that we need some account of substance that could explain how self-conscious thinking and self-determining agency could emerge out of a material world otherwise devoid of these capacities? If so, this would seem to lead us into Schelling's language of a material's nature's self-negating of its own self-conscious materiality, something that might be easier to understand if we also follow Schelling into a notion of the absolute that manifests itself as both a living material nature with this capacity for self-negation and the results of that self-negation, which can be identified as neither. I'm sorry about the obscurity, that's the way Schelling talks. Hegel treats this way of looking at the problem as a complex of category mistakes. The question of the evolutionary conditions for the emergence of consciousness and language is an empirical question, just as is the question of what capacities the brain must have for there to be consciousness and language use. Again, the proper question is philosophical, or in Hegel's terms, logical. In his encyclopedia system, the transition from nature to spirit is not a question of substance. At some point, and it doesn't matter for philosophy at what point or how, natural organisms reach a level of complexity and organization such that they begin to become occupied with themselves and each other, and eventually to engage each other and to understand themselves in ways no longer appropriately explicable within the boundaries of explanations proper to nature considered apart from such capacities. Hegel's language about this is everywhere practical, not substantive. It is not that Hegel is denying that self-consciousness and intentional agency are facts in the world. He is simply claiming that no fact about the organic properties of such beings accounts for what it is to be self-conscious or agents, and that is the prior question. Those are categories of achievement for Hegel, indeed collective achievement, and the question of what is achieved is for him an autonomous philosophical question. Of course, what he calls spirit, Geist, remains embodied and so subject to mixed explanations, in which its natural properties bear on its activities as spirit, things like age, geography, and diet. This is what Hegel calls in the encyclopedia anthropology, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about it. But fundamentally, spirit is said to be its own, quote, self-liberation from nature. And spirit is another paradoxical phrase, a product of itself. And its actuality is that it has, quote, made itself into what it is. Consider this famous passage from the Lectures on Art. Art, which is one of the means of this self-liberation, by means of its representations, while remaining within the sensuous sphere, liberates man at the same time from the power of sensuousness. Of course, we may often hear favorite phraseology about man's duty to remain in immediate unity with nature. Hegel's not a romantic. But such unity in its abstraction is purely and simply rudeness and ferocity. And by dissolving this unity from man, art lifts him with gentle hands out of and above imprisonment in nature. It's a little extreme. Even I don't believe that. I mean, there's got to be a better way of talking about our relation to nature. Liberation from prison. It doesn't matter that there are also natural scientific explanations of what happens in the body and brain when all this occurs, say, when we make or enjoy art. The question that's emerged, the only emergence that is relevant, is whether the norm art has in one instance or another been rightly and fully realized, or whether the justifications agents offer each other and themselves can in fact be defended, whether the structure of ethical life is consistent with the potential of such self-liberating beings. There's no need to appeal to a vitalist, self-directing nature to account for any of this. As we've been seeing, the dynamic for Hegel is historical, not biological, even though it clearly has numerous specific natural organic conditions. Correspondingly, the question of the possibility of freedom is not for Hegel a question about how a spontaneous causal agency exists in a material world. His theory is a self-realization theory, and that asks for the right achievement in our understanding of ourselves and in our relations to others. Again, for him, a historical and social question, not one that descends from any account of substance. Likewise, Hegel does not treat the concept as the ground of the existence of nature, or in any ontological sense, as prior to nature. The minimal way to characterize the transition from logic to the philosophy of nature in the encyclopedia is that the transition entails that the conceptual structure of any interrogation of nature or spirit cannot be coherently understood as wholly empirically determined. Again, we're talking about all those issues we mentioned before. Finitude, infinity, limit, unlimited, substance, property, accident, necessity, contingency, possibility, appearance, essence, and so forth. All of that must, Hegel thinks, be manifested in a philosophical account of nature, and the philosophy of nature is his attempt to show that it is, as nature was understood at the time. Each aspect of the real philosophy should be shown to depend in some way on a non-derived conceptual structure manifested in its pure form in the logic. This characterization of dependence is not incorrect, but it still admittedly doesn't distinguish how Hegel thinks of that relationship in a way that will exclude the common sense notion of an empty subjective form being filled by objective empirical experience or imposed on extra logical material. He doesn't mean that. This can't be right because on Hegel's approach, any conceptual structure already determines a determinately intelligible empirical content. But it does not and should not determine or derive or certainly deduce, as people sometimes think Hegel wanted to do, the existent content itself. There are passages around 250 in the Philosophy of Nature where he says it's the last thing you want to do. It persists as an interpretation of Hegel. As he says in the penultimate paragraph on the Encyclopedia Logic, the method is not an external form, but the soul and concept of the content, from which it is distinguished only insofar as the moments of the concept, even in themselves, in their respective determinacy, come to appear as the totality of the concept of any intelligibility at all. But the move to the Encyclopedia Philosophies of Nature and Spirit, in that move, the identity of form must mean that we should also attend to logical form, but now understood as in some way inflected by attention to the form of what is wholly other than pure thought in space and time, and the form of human action in the world, including collective human action. What does the inevitability of the distinction between essence and appearance look like in the manifestations of the natural world and in the manifestations of human practices in historical time? How do we make use of that distinction if it's crucial to rendering any such practice intelligible? That's what he tries to show us in that account. The conceptual structures laid out in both parts aspire to a conceptual or a priori truth. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Even if the results of the empirical sciences and historical actuality are everywhere incorporated. This is largely what Hegel means when he says frequently that spirit seeks to find itself in nature and in its own practices. It seeks to understand them, to understand their intelligible form. But as already noted, this is not because Hegel thinks of either part as a result of a simple application of the moments of a being and essence logic to an external indifferent matter. In fact, Hegel himself makes the very point that Schelling in the later lectures considers a damning criticism of Hegel. The idea is still logical. It's shut up in pure thought, the science only of the divine concept. Its systematic exposition is, of course, itself a realization, but one confined within the same sphere. Because the pure idea of cognition is to this extent shut up within subjectivity, it is, a kind of strange word, the impulse to sublate it. And pure truth becomes, as final result, also the beginning of another sphere and science. But this transition to a consideration of nature is not a deduction of nature's existence, nor could it be. It's once again described in practical terms as a felt practical insufficiency in any full comprehension of the results of the logic. Last section. By far the deepest, in my view, and most thoughtful engagement with Hegel's thought in post-Hegelian philosophy is Heidegger's. In fact, a good case can be made that his is the first genuine confrontation with Hegel in all of the post-Hegelian traditions. For our purposes, the discussion that's essentially important is what was published as the second part of a book now called Identity and Difference, originally a seminar and later also a lecture, The Onto-Theological Construction of Metaphysics. This is because Heidegger goes immediately and directly to the heart of Hegel's enterprise and states it accurately as just what it is. Heidegger tells us the subject matter, the Sache of thinking, for Hegel is thinking. And he immediately adds exactly, oh, thank you so much, very kind of you, exactly the right qualification. In order not to misinterpret this definition of the matter, thinking as such in psychological or epistemological terms, we must add by way of explanation, thinking as such in the developed fullness in which what has been thought has been and now is thought. I'm not sure that's the most lucid explanation, but he is at least trying to exclude the psychological and empirical and trying to give us an account of the nature of thinking as thinking in Hegel, as an independent topic, not as a matter of psychology or epistemology. Thinking in the fullness of what has been thought is Heidegger's formulation of the Hegelian claim that logic, properly understood, is metaphysics. The thinking of pure thinking is at the same time the thinking of the world in its thinkability, what has been and is now being thought. He reminds us that we can only understand this beginning from Kant's viewpoint, although not like Kant, transcendentally, but speculatively. That is, Hegel thinks thinking as being, Heidegger tells us, and not as a subjective epistemological condition or as an event in an immaterial world. Or Heidegger realizes that pure thinking's taking itself as object does not result in a mere theory of thinking or the rules of thinking or a philosophy of pure cognition. As Heidegger says directly for Hegel, quote, being is the absolute self-thinking of thinking. These are obscure and hard thoughts, but I think it's obvious, already from the quotation, Heidegger has got Hegel exactly right. And if he's going to have a criticism of Hegel, it will be powerful, because he's understood Hegel. The last thing Heidegger means by this is that being is mental activity, whether human or divine. That would merely be an account of one of the beings, a subject matter of one of the special sciences, and would presuppose a logic of intelligibility. Because of his own approach, Heidegger is in a unique position to realize that the subject matter of the logic is not in any sense whatsoever a being, not the absolute self-positing, not the noetic substructure of the world, not abstract objects, not the mind of the Christian God, not a substance, but in his language, the meaning of being, der Sinn des Seins. As he puts it in his distinctive language, the being of beings reveals itself as the ground that gives itself ground and accounts for itself, thinking's determination of its own moments. The ground, the ratio by their essential origin, are the logos in the sense of the gathering of beings and letting them be. This is Heideggerese. Sorry about that. They are the hen panta, the all one. Thus, science, that is, metaphysics, is in truth not logic. We now understand the name logic in the essential sense, which includes also the title used by Hegel, and only thus explains it, as the name for that kind of thinking which everywhere provides and accounts for the ground of beings as such within the whole in terms of being as ground, that is, logos. The fundamental character is ontotheologic. The divine at stake, in what Heidegger means by theologic, is, he constantly explains, not a being, not anyone, and he goes so far as to say, to whom we can pray or play music or dance to. He notes almost with a hint of contempt. Ontotheology is over for Hegel, the theology that considered God a being. And Hegel was for him the first to realize that the divine aspect of thinking has nothing to do with a being's thinking, but to the absoluteness of thinking. Because in Hegel, as the culmination of all metaphysical thinking, thinking is divine because it's self-grounding and serves as ground for any being being intelligibly what it is. Because of all of this, thinking is also theology, because it concerns the causa sui. So in summation from Heidegger, metaphysics responds to being as logic and is accordingly in its basic characteristics everywhere logic, but a logic that thinks the being of the beings, and thus logic which is determined by what differs in the difference. Ontotheologic, the difference between being and the account of any of the beings, the particular sciences. As we'll see, Heidegger means that metaphysics is determined by this difference between being and the beings, without metaphysics, and Hegel included, being able to think this difference properly. It is and remains unthought in metaphysical thinking. Compare what Heidegger is saying to what Hegel says, and the accuracy of Heidegger's characterization will be immediately clear. The logical is to be thought, this is Hegel, in a system of thought determinations in which the antithesis between subjective and objective in its usual meaning disappears. This meaning of thinking and of its determinations is more precisely expressed by the ancients when they say that nous governs the world, or by our own saying that there is reason in the world, by which we mean that reason is the soul of the world, inhabits it, and is immanent in it as its innermost nature, its universal. I mean, once you could see that in Hegel's, intuitively, if you're coming to this for the first time, I don't know what to say if you're coming to it for the first time, but there is a kind of intuitive rejection of all of this, as if Hegel is saying we can sort of pull the basic structure of reality out of thinking spontaneously. And there isn't much reason to believe we could do anything even putatively that, and then very little reason to believe initially that the results actually, because the self-determination of pure thinking, count as what it is to be any determinate being, that give us the moments necessary for anything to be a determinate being. But that's not Heidegger's objection. He thinks all that's just dandy, that this is the key insight into what all of metaphysics has been trying to do. He just thinks there's something unthought in it, and that the unthought is what we're now going to hear more about. Heidegger has a problem with metaphysical thinking. He notes approvingly that Hegel's approach is developmental. We come to the determinations of thinking by trying to think, first of, any object at all, being, thinking being, anything at all, and then determining what we would have to think even anything at all. That it's developmental, not deductive, and that this developmental thought, thinking, is intertwined also with the history of thought, with the history of philosophy. In his engagement with this thinking, Hegel tries to think rightly what really has been thought in the developing positions, and that Hegel's attempt is a sublation, a preserving and raising up of all that has been rightly but partly thought into a whole. Heidegger accepts this intertwining with the history of thought, but he says his own approach is to think what has remained forever unthought in the metaphysical tradition, remains hidden in the history of thinking as logos. Accordingly, he says his engagement is not an elevation or sublation, not progressive, but a step back, or Schritt zurück. While Hegel thinks the ultimate identity of thinking and being, Heidegger's basic thought, he says, is difference. Thinking's determination of absolute intelligibility actually, he says, recedes before the true subject matter of thought, being itself. Something remains unasked, the difference between being and the beings. Again, recall, I always find it helpful to mention Aristotle. Hegel follows Aristotle. The task of first philosophy is not to determine of anything what it is, but to determine of anything at all what it must be, such that the question, what is it, could have some purchase. That's the Hegelian version of what Heidegger calls the ontological difference, first philosophy, and the special ontic sciences of what is it, of the beings. Heidegger is objecting that this leaves unasked why the thinkability of any being is limited to what it is to be a being. That leaves the question of being qua being simply assumed, already determined as thinkable determinacy itself. But that means it's unthought, just assumed. Why should the meaning of any being, of all being, be the determinacy of being as just what it is? You might think, well, so what if it's unthought? Not a very interesting thought to think something other than that. Heidegger's going to make an enormous amount of hay out of that this question is unthought, presupposed, dogmatic. The meaning of being shouldn't be understood immediately as the conditions necessary for the determinacy of any being. There's a deeper question about being and meaning that isn't asked. So, in conclusion, if Heidegger has rightly characterized the nature of Hegel's project, and I think he has, what isn't in the logic as metaphysics project in Hegel that does remain, in this sense, unasked or unthought? As just noted, the answer is supposed to be this absolute difference between the meaning of being and the meaning of any beings, which is what drives the logic, how to come up with the conditions of determinacy. And Heidegger is just saying that leaves the question of the meaning of being unasked. This is, of course, Heidegger's master thought throughout his career, but what does the thought and the criticism mean in Hegel's terms? The first thing one could say is that Heidegger is right about the logic. Hegel does insist that the question of being necessarily always amounts to a question about what it is to be this or that being. That's correct. Hegel does believe that. That's the result of the first moment of the being logic, and it is that moment where the deepest confrontation with Heidegger must take place. But as just noted, Hegel's formulation doesn't seem to reach the question Heidegger is interested in, since it is, for Heidegger, unthinkingly already oriented from the question of the intelligibility of any one being, Seiende in Heidegger's terms. As Heidegger realizes, the closest formulation in Hegel for the question, the being of beings, the meaning of being itself, is simply pure thinking, determinate intelligibility. That is the meaning of being. But that topic, which Heidegger wants to treat as being's own manifestation, the meaning of being, its unconcealing or happening, and so what pure thinking or judging must presuppose, that topic in Hegel is not a topic or moment of pure thinking. There is no interrogation of whether the meaning of being is intelligibility, determinate intelligibility in the logic. Although we've reached the point where a very great deal would have to be said about Heidegger's unusual language, it's also here that we do seem to reach some sort of absence in Hegel's enterprise, even if whether that means that something crucial is missing or not is a separate question. If the being of beings, the absolute, is thinkability, have we asked in the logic what it is, what it means to be thinkable? Thinkability is not one of the determinate moments of the logic. And when judgment's own characteristics become self-conscious in the last part, the concept logic, it's just the forms of judging this or that in their determinate possible inferential relations that is attended to. I noted before that Hegel thinks we cannot provide an independent theory of the thinkable as such. We can merely manifest thinking by pure thinking. We know what pure thinking is by thinking, like action, like belief. Any other formulation would presuppose and so elude itself. But this means that the science of pure thinking does and cannot count pure thinking itself as one of its moments. And from Heidegger's point of view, this is not adequate. A massive criticism of Western rationalism follows from this point in Heidegger. What we learn in the process of trying to think anything at all determinately is that the possible determinacy of any being can be made out. Thinking is the enacting of thinking, and the reflective self-consciousness at the end of the logic, the concept of intelligibility itself, is a form of self-consciousness about the intelligibility, again, of any being, not something like the thought of being as intelligibility itself. That is always unasked, unthought, presupposed, even if everywhere for Hegel unavoidable, manifested, enacted. The concept logic is supposed to allow the inclusion of the logic itself inside the concept. But that just covers what we've been through in the book, what thinking of any being amounts to. It does not and cannot include what Heidegger seems to be after. What does it mean for being to be thinking self-determination of thinking? That question both must be and cannot be inside the concept. Put another way, logic itself, or the question what is logic, is not a possible moment in the logic. And we know from Heidegger's 1928 lecture course, now published as The Metaphysical Foundations of Logic, Heidegger thinks that question is deeply intertwined with the meaning of being question. So Heidegger is right, I think, that the question remains unthought, unasked. It can't be. But this also raises the question of whether Heidegger is right to draw the rather apocalyptic consequences he does from this supposed forgetting or not asking the question. But it also raises what might seem like an unusual question from Heidegger's point of view. Is all of this actually a problem? It's not as if Heidegger thinks this elusive topic should have been a moment within the logic. That would have turned it into a moment of determinacy itself. He is, in many other works, asking for other modes of interrogation. That's why his work becomes so strange. First, from a fundamental ontology, form of phenomenology, to such strange notions as Gelassenheit, or releasedness, or Andenken, or kind of pious thinking, or a Denken that he says is a Danken, a thanking, to the intimation of the fourfold, kind of farmer metaphysics of earth and wind and sky. But from Hegel's point of view, there is no reason to believe that these attempts would not generate their own form, again, of difference, and so elusiveness. And for Hegel, this would be because the only kind of interrogation of being there could be is the interrogation of any determinate being, and the mode of those determinations, thought determinations, Denkbestimmungen. It might be Heideggerian enough for Hegel to invoke another formulation of the same problem, that thinkability as the meaning of being can only be shown, not said. Thanks for your patience. That was a lot.
Speak a little bit about how Hegel's logic is related to his theory of the struggle for recognition, in which you mentioned earlier somewhat in your talk that the beings somehow emerge out of nature and they're interacting with each other. But I want to hear a little bit more from what you think about how the structure of our logical consciousness and our ability to self-reflect and all that is conditioned by a particular interaction between human beings, and whether or not Hegel in some sense presupposes what he set out to prove by embedding the potentiality for such thinking in these creatures that do interact, and then from there in their interactions emerge to some kind of optimistic conclusion, and whether or not that's something justifiable or not.
I mean, the first thing one has to say is something about Hegel's systematic enterprise. So the basic statement of Hegelian philosophy is not the 1807 phenomenology, which was a kind of introduction to it, where the most famous passage about the struggle for recognition of opposed self-consciousnesses occur, but the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, 1817, 1821, 1830. Three different versions of it. And the structure of that is logic, philosophy of nature, philosophy of spirit. In the philosophy of spirit, there's a section called phenomenology, and it's there that the struggle for recognition is a moment in the articulation of the intelligibility of human practices, how human beings engage each other in the struggle to become self-conscious beings. So that prompts a second point, which is there's no reason to think that every problem in Hegel is a historically inflected, materially or socially relevant problematic. The science of logic is not. It's pure philosophy. It's a science of pure thinking, the thinking of any intelligibility. There is, though, in the science of intelligibility in general, a way of understanding why a person's own free self-realization should be dependent on the free self-realization of another, which is not a standard way of thinking about freedom. The basic doctrine of freedom in Hegel, in the philosophy of spirit, that is, as he tries to understand how the basic structure of any intelligibility can be seen to be manifest in the account of human practices he gives in the philosophy of spirit, in the enterprise that that's part of, he then confronts the fact of a singular desiring agent who confronts I'm not really as sick as I sound, another singular desiring agent. And ultimately the position he wants to reach is a conception of freedom which he calls being a self in the other, Selbstsein im anderen sein. That's an extremely unusual relationship. It means that what appears to be the limitation originally of your own restricted activity by virtue of another person's occupying finite space isn't really a limitation, that it's the condition of its realization. So the longer answer to your question would be how a different way of thinking about the relationship between self and other, which is ultimately grounded in the essence logic, in the science of logic, is manifested in what was at the time and is still today uninspiring but deeply unusual thought, that I can't be free unless you are. Normally it would just seem I can just be free fine, and it's maybe unjust or unfair that you can't be free. But that relationship, that being a self is being a self in the other. I mean, his examples of freedom, for example, the primary one is love, and the other one is friendship. Those are the true manifestations of human freedom, in which the presence of others are not limitations on the exercise of my agency, but conditions for its objective realization. But all of that depends on a very unusual, the simplest way to respond, all of that depends on a very unusual thought, that the normal relationship between a finite being and its restrictive other is a very limited way of thinking about it, and if we understand the course of the logic, we'll come to understand better something about the relationship that will help us understand how it could be that we'd reach this really unusual point. The point itself is given flesh and bone by Hegel and blood inside of a kind of phenomenological account, doesn't refer to the logic. And the 2 points can be separated. You can make what Hegel is trying to say lucid just in terms of the concept of phenomenology itself, if you understand what that is doing in the philosophy of spirit. But ultimately, as I said, there's an unusual thought behind it, and the easiest way to answer your question is just to say we need to think about that thought, because it's a very unusual thought, that self-realization is not limited by the other, but takes the other as its condition.
Thank you.
Yeah. That does.
Great, thanks so much. I have 2 questions about finitude and where your conclusion left us with regard to finitude.
With finitude?
With regard to finitude, yeah. So, because, one way to put the way you were concluding could make it look like an ironic outcome in a certain sense, because Heidegger is the thinker of finitude, right? He complains about, we think about this kind of infinite spirit and so on. But now the frontline that you were describing was Heidegger asking the unasked question of being as such, not the being of this being or that being, or each and every finite determination, particularly, but being as such. Whereas the way you portray Hegel, it's true that this question remains unasked, but only because this is the appropriate way to ask the question is to investigate each and every finite being, to go through them, and you have to go through them infinitely in a certain sense. So that there is a certain, there's this phrase in Hegel where it seems that the infinity that he describes is an infinity of finitude, an infinity of finitization. So that we could portray the outcome of the whole thing as somehow being, there is a certain finitude that is already involved in Hegel's account, and Heidegger asking for something infinite of a different sort. This would be a very ironic...
The right criticism of Heidegger, yeah, that he's hoisted by his own infinity petard, or something like that. Yeah, I like that. But I mean, it depends on how one characterizes the rather indirect way Hegel is raising the question of the meaning of being as such. I mean, it does manifest itself as thinkability, and it manifests itself by attending to all the possible ways in which it could be constrained, limited, and incorporating them into it, by sort of systematically destroying the idea of the in principle unthinkable, the in principle unintelligible as an empty position. So it does emerge in that sense. But I think the problem with Heidegger is that, and this is a very difficult thing to summarize in a way that, well, as you know, he doesn't want the meaning of being questioned, which looks like he's saying, we don't have an answer for it, I want now an answer. It's exactly what he doesn't mean. He means that the idea that there's an absence in this question that we need to fill is metaphysics. I know you're saying, well, what's the point of raising the question if there isn't a kind of determinate answer to it? But Heidegger thinks it has a bearing on us. What looks like its absence, it can be rethought. We don't really understand what it is to be. And in a way, there's a kind of finality to that in Heidegger that he thinks we have covered over. So, I mean, I think his position is more radical than the ironic rejoinder. Then it opens the question of, well, if it's more radical, what's he talking about? If he means there's a constantly, and he, by the end of the 30s and the 40s, he's already talking about what being is in its manifestation is its concealing. Its revealing and concealing structure is all that there is to the meaning of being. And that's, in a way, from a Hegelian point of view, not a very satisfactory, yeah, exactly, right. And you reach a point where there's almost a kind of begging the question standoff. Because Heidegger is going to claim that the assumptions by which this is unsatisfying in Hegel are just, in a way, begging all the questions that he wants to raise, whereas Hegel is trying to say, well, no, you're begging the question by assuming there's always something outside of the regime of intelligibility. I mean, in a way, that's kind of an empty point. You can always just say, well, how do you know there's not something outside the realm of the regime of intelligibility in Western metaphysics? And, I mean, maybe it can emerge historically or something like that. All Hegel can say is, give me one. Show me. Like what? And then begin to ask, under what conditions is that identifiable as the thing you're pointing to? And Heidegger then throws up his hands. So you're begging the question again. You're invoking the regime. I don't want the police called and that question asked me. I want you to answer it without the police. And Hegel says, that's begging the question. It's not the police, for God's sakes. That kind of thing. So it's very, very delicate. I find myself more and more sort of bothered that I haven't quite understood the force of Heidegger's problem. I get more and more the sense that there's something there, that there's something about the Hegelian self-enclosure that is problematic in a way that's quite significant for the history of Western thought in general, for the sort of the arrogance of the sort of self-satisfaction of reason. I'm sort of a little more bothered by that than I was 20 or 30 years ago. So I'm trying to understand this, but I can't quite get over the Heideggerian, whatever it is, bridge to the promised land. I still think, hey, it's just, Hegel seems right.
Please tell me if I misunderstand. Not as good hearing as I'm reading, as fun as it was. But so doesn't it seem to me that the question shifts then from what is the source of thinking, and rather how does one become introduced into thinking? Particularly, like I think of like children, who obviously aren't rational agents to begin with, particularly babies. But at some point, they get to some region where they're now able to follow this Hegelian, imperative, just do thinking. How does it get to that point? How does it, or
right.
if I understand you correctly, is that the transition of the question?
No, I mean, I think Hegel has no objection to that question. Very interesting question. How do children come to think? Now think of another question. What is it to think? How did human beings come to first make art? What is art? Two different questions. One presupposes the other. Now, nowadays, post-Danto and everything, we're willing to say it's a very difficult issue for Hegel, because Hegel thinks, on the one hand, that what counts as art is a historical development, that there are different conceptions of art in different historical periods, and that we can give an account of the genesis of art, not maybe the genesis of the human desire for art, although that might be an interesting question in itself, and so forth. But it presupposes that we know what we're talking about when we're doing neuroaesthetics and we think we've identified art. I mean, most of the people who do neuroaesthetics don't care about that question. They just hook somebody up and show them some god-awful print of something, and they say, oh, look at the pleasure centers lighting up and the blood flowing to those sections of the brain, something like that. But we don't want to be satisfied with that as philosophers. We want to know, well, why is that crap they're looking at called art? It doesn't seem to me to be art. But since Hegel has a developmental account of the changing structure of what counts as art over historical time, he still nevertheless wants to say that there could be manifest in some societies practices that are called art as if they're in the same tradition, and they're not. That's a difficult position. The latter sounds more essentialist. The former sounds more historicist. And the great virtue and great problem of Hegel is he exactly wants both. It is true that art is a historical practice that changes its shape and function and nature over time, but there's a limit. At some point, things can be paraded around as art that aren't art, and we should be worried about that. We shouldn't let that concept go. It's too important. I mean, for Hegel, it's a sensible, affective mode of understanding the absolute. It's a mode of self-understanding that we want to understand in its specificity. But the question of either the historical generation of the category or the psychological generation of the capacity to appreciate it in children or something like that, those are for him empirical questions that are fine. But the point to be made, and this drives people somewhat crazy because it's a kind of arrogant assumption that first listen to the philosophers. Let them figure out what art is before you go worrying about wiring people up when they experience it. But the next step is there's no agreement in philosophy about what art is. So it doesn't do any good to go consult the philosophers. You consult 15 different positions. But Hegel thinks, he's got an answer to the question, and all you can do is try to give it. But he doesn't think of it as subject to empirical stories about its genesis as part of the answer to what it is. That's a philosophical question.
So regarding Hegel's identity of subject and substance, I have a question about something that he says, I think, in the beginning of the Phenomenology of the Spirit, but I can't quote verbatim, but he says something like, this could either be taken as the road to truth or whatever, but it could also be regarded as a pathway to doubt and endless skepticism.
Pathway of despair, yeah.
And I take it that he genuinely is there genuinely is a choice of interpretation on the reader's part. So do you think it's, my first question is, do you think it's plausible that this is an implicit concession on Hegel's part to the kind of criticism that Schelling later brought up, that it's only negative philosophy pretending to be positive philosophy?
Yeah.
And my second question is, do you think, how does Heidegger's analysis of the fundamental meaning of being help us fare better against sort of this looming question of skepticism, or is that just not a question that Heidegger is interested in?
Yeah. Let me try the first one first. It isn't up to the reader, according to Hegel. What he's trying to say is, a lot of people are frustrated with philosophy because every time there's a settled philosophical school of thought or position, like empiricism in Britain, or rationalism, then comes empiricism, then comes Kant, then comes Hegel, and people throw up their hands and say, well, philosophy is just constantly self-devouring enterprise. Why should I bother with it? There's never any kind of answers. And Hegel's first response is, it's not bad that philosophy is a self-critical, evolving enterprise. That might look like the pathway of despair. But philosophy is all about this moment of self-negation. That's how philosophy grows into a more adequate historical position. This assumes that the course of positions in philosophy has a kind of intelligibility to it. Very few people think that anymore. If anything, they think that there are just several classic philosophical options in the firmament, and when you're in graduate school, you should pick one and read the latest stuff on it and work on it. Hegel wants to ask, well, how did they get to be the positions that are canonized as the firmament? What does it mean that they're in opposition to each other in the way they are? Is there any way of thinking about that? That can look like the pathway of despair, but it isn't. That's a promise on his part. And if you keep faith with Hegel, you have to at least give him a few years to try to convince you that it makes some sense that the basic positions in philosophy have developed as they have, and that they can be put into a coherent whole. The thing that people who are attracted to Heidegger find so pressing about his questions is, to put it very simply, everything I've been saying about Hegel, you could put by saying the assumption that the determinations of pure thinking are the determinations of being is not some sort of fancy speculative identity that cannot be denied. It's the imposition of a regime of sense-making on an other to thought that is considered the mere material for thought. Heidegger's account of the history of philosophy is radically declensionist rather than progressive. It's just the opposite of Hegel's. Once we start from the assumption that to be is to be intelligible, we've made what there is as being subject to our regime of intelligibility. Hegel thinks the our there is question-begging and wrong, but you can see the force of what Heidegger is trying to say. And the ultimate end of this story is what Heidegger calls technology, the technological enframing, where we understand ourselves and the world as material for some kind of rationalist imposition of some kind of intelligible structure. Our own bodies become medicalized and materialized as subjects for scientific enterprise, for example, or something like that. We begin to understand ourselves differently because this regime of sense-making has been imposed on something that doesn't have its own voice, that is just incorporated inside the machine. This is, even though Adorno keeps saying how much he hates Heidegger, for those of you who know Adorno, you know this is something Adorno swallowed hook, line, and sinker. That Hegel represents the epitome of philosophy as a kind of great devouring mouth, consuming everything in its own self-satisfaction. So that I think the people who are really genuinely influenced by Heidegger, or who find him in college or graduate school or when they're reading him, a warning sign of some respects, is that this makes some sense to them. Not so much skepticism, but to a kind of appropriation of being for the sake of the intelligible that isn't a speculative identity, but an appropriation, a devouring, a manipulation, subjective hubris, self-assertion of the point of view of Western rationalism that needs to be guarded against. That's Heidegger's big influence, to convince people there was a danger here. Heidegger calls it nihilism. The classical view, which Hegel is the last one to share, I put it this way, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but that being is good. What does that mean, being is good? It allows its own intelligibility. It is not hostile to us. It is appropriate to our demands that it be made intelligible. You can easily imagine that that would not be the case. And another way of answering your question is, how does Hegel know it's not the case? Maybe there's just a whole bunch that we think we've rendered intelligible that lies out, and we've left a lot of stuff out. And I've tried to say before, that question is an idle question for Hegel until you bring up something and tell him he can't deal with it. And as soon as that happens, he sort of has you. But Heidegger doesn't think being is good. He thinks it hides. That's why he loves Heraclitus. Nature hides. Right, is there somebody else who wants to ask? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a suggestion regarding how to understand the front line between Hegel and Heidegger in the terms of your the panorama that you just unfolded. And I would suggest maybe a huge part of this front line is the question, how to conceive, how to think about thinking itself. So, because I would say what Heidegger doesn't buy from the beginning is the discursivity thesis.
Yeah.
And I think this might be the real, or the much harder front line. Like the question, if rather than the question you outlined at the end of your talk, the question of being or being as the unthought in the whole history of metaphysics and so on. Because I think Heidegger from the beginning, like from being in time and what understanding, Erschlossenheit, and so on is, he combines a certain sense of spontaneity with a certain sense of receptiveness or receptivity that is not at one with central receptivity or perceptual receptivity, which is something like a genuine receptiveness of thinking itself. I think this is for Heidegger from the beginning of his thinking very central, which is why he, for instance, in his later thinking, he refers on poetry, for instance, as a kind of thinking which is mainly some hearing, a listening to, and so on. I cannot give you the full argument or claim here, but I think this seems to be a huge difference. A non-idealist moment in Heidegger, and maybe the real source of his claims to radical finitude with regard to Hegel.
Yeah, I think you're certainly right. That is a point of great possible contestability between them. The trouble is one needs to, I think you probably would agree, that by introducing the notion of, there's all these Gelassenheit kind of phrases, even in being in time. There's quite a lot of stuff of letting something be or letting something approach you or not letting it approach you or something.
Logically in this phenomenology.
There's all that already, you're quite right, already in being in time. Now, the problem is that, I think we would agree, is not a reversion to the rationalist or Platonic notion of noesis, because it's not fixated. Traditional rationalism believes that there is such a thing as a priori philosophy because pure reason has its special objects that only pure reason can attend to, nonsensible objects, monads, thinking substances, Platonic ideas, forms, God. That's traditional rationalism, and it's receptive in the sense in which there's a light of reason, a light of nature, a noesis, an intuition, by virtue of which the undeniability of a claim can be maintained by virtue of having seen it, of there being an intuitive light of reason. That is not what Heidegger is trying to revert to. So then the question is, well, what? Because there is also in Hegel's notion and Kant's notion of productivity, that thinking is discursively sort of predicative or judgmental, there has to be a kind of passive moment of seeing what you've done. There has to be already a kind of complementary. It's just that the seeing, the passivity, is focused on itself. It's still there because, if you've predicated and determined, there are all kinds of implications you have to see. You have to see what else you're committed to. You have to see what you've just done. You have to see the alternatives that you've excluded. All that has to be in some sense part of your awareness. So there is a passive moment. It's just the idea that the fundamental activity that's primary is discursive thinking, judgmental or predicative. Now, Heidegger, in his own notions of assertion and so forth, is trying to work around that. In his lectures on logic, he's very aware. But I'm not convinced that he's given us a way of really understanding what this passive Andenken, Gelassenheit moment, a Danken, a receptive, a letting be moment amounts to. Because what Hegel is going to always be interested in is its object. And Heidegger will resist that that's not the right way of thinking about it. There's it has more, it's going to start sounding like Scientology or something. But even passivity is probably not the right way to put it, but I see what you're asking. He wants being to be a kind of sight, a clearing, Lichtung, of their being.
Thinking sort of suffers.
Yeah.
It is geworfen.
Yeah. But it doesn't have a particular object. That's just the point. It's the sight at which the meaning of being both manifests itself and withdraws. But I find this all very hard to understand. But as I say, I'm not completely convinced there isn't something left out of what is kind of the complete self-determination by thinking of its own possibility in Hegel, or by any form of traditional rationalism at work in Anglophone philosophy or critical theory or just about anything else. So there's not something radically left out, but the alternative, although it doesn't have to do with any kind of passive perception of objects in Heidegger, is just for that reason hard for me to get my hand around. I don't know what a clearing is. Yeah. I think you're the only one.
No one else.
I think we're back.
I'll pick your brain if you don't mind. So I have two questions. One is on that. Your summation of being is good for Hegel and being is hostile. Not bad, but hostile for Heidegger is so illuminating. But then wouldn't it be the case, particularly if we have to let the question engage us? So we can't just ask the question. We have to be willing to the destruction, or the possible destruction of the question. Wouldn't then the question of the being of being, as you said, if being is declinations all the way down, wouldn't it just be a return to the beginning, allowing a restarting?
Yeah.
At least that seems to me to be like the productive, unless I'm misunderstanding, it seems to be the productive claim that Heidegger's making, is that we're not reaching absolution, we're not reaching completion, we're actually getting farther away from it. And so
that's exactly what Heidegger means. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's what he means.
Okay, all right, good.
We go back to Parmenides and Heraclitus. Everything bad starts with Plato, which is kind of. I mean, this is one of the things Gadamer, his best student in a way, and his most influenced student, could never swallow. That beautiful Plato is the beginning of nihilism. But that's Heidegger's claim.
The other question I had then, because this is something I don't think I agree with you on, but hopefully I'll get destroyed. You said that God is no longer a being, which in the letter on humanism, Heidegger has that short little thing about God being valued and that being a nihilism in itself. So I especially with his later stuff on especially God's being part of the fourfold and all that, it seems like they are beings, unless I'm misunderstanding. On the other hand, too, he also says that the default of God is a default to be absent. So I just wanted you to elaborate a bit more.
Well, I mean, what became the idea of religion after ontotheology in theology, which was quite influential, since Heidegger is now probably the most influential figure in contemporary theology, became so-called negative theology. I mean, my colleague Jean-Luc Marion is the epitome. It's good that God died. Now he can be God. That kind of thing. It's really by negative determination that the manifestation of God as not a being, but the meaning of all being can be manifest. So, I mean, the letter on humanism, I mean, you have to take into account, first of all, that, especially what he says about Marx, Heidegger is writing in occupied France. He wants to get back to work. And so I think a lot of the letter on humanism, which was so influential in France, is a political document meant to protect himself. He knows where they're coming for him. And so all of a sudden, Marx is a great thinker. God is God. Don't let him be a value. It's just a lot of BS in that letter. The later stuff on ontotheology is all consistent with the rejection of God as a being. But that doesn't mean there's not a religious element in Heidegger. I don't quite mean to say that. But there is a hesitation to adopt any of the traditional Christian theological apologetics that we know from scholasticism.
Was there a privilege that the Greeks had being polytheistic or such, or is that too just another step?
He doesn't talk much about religion. I don't think he takes seriously polytheism as a moment in Greek thought, as much as he focuses mostly on philosophy. I think he thought they were. I mean, there is the question of Aristotle, so he does have a lot of things to say about Aristotle. And what's interesting about Aristotle, which he sort of comes close to understanding, is that when you ask yourself, I mean, one version of your question before about children is, well, yeah, we know about thinking, pure thinking, by trying to think. But why do we try to think? Where does that come from? The animation for philosophy. So there's a dynamic, erotic component to the beginning of the enterprise of Hegel. We want something. We want to think. where does that's not part of thinking. That's the condition of thinking. It's an erotic desire. We need completion, we need to think. Why do we need to think? Where's that in Hegel? Where's the origin of the logic? There's a phenomenological introduction to the logic that explains why in thinking we would come to the standpoint of absolute thinking, pure thinking, thinking itself. That doesn't answer the question. What is the place of thinking in a human life? Where is it a game that we play? Or is there something connected in the aporia of everyday life that makes pure thinking ultimately inevitable? I mean, these are very vague questions, but there isn't really a kind of approach to them in Hegel. And, well, there isn't, I mean, that's not quite true. It's a long question, but there is something more of the grip of a question like that in Heidegger, of the meaning of being having an existential priority. Whereas in Hegel, if you ask, well, what is the point of the unthinkability of the pure thought of anything at all? What is the point of it? What's disturbing about it? Why start it? There's something left out. Maybe that's one way of saying what's left out in Hegel, what Heidegger is worried about. There's something left out, the meaning of thinking. I mean, in all the ways Heidegger means the question of Sinn, or meaning. Its significance for us, its unavoidability, its pressingness, its dramatic necessity is absent in the beginning of the logic. With what must science begin is the first section of the logic. It's all about logic, about being. Where you want him to answer the question in a somewhat different way. Yeah?
Thanks. So I think I've noticed that so far we've discussed logic, thinking, and being, but I guess I wonder to what degree language functions in all of this. So I guess, could you say a bit about how language functions in the impasse that you see? I think you've identified between
Hegel, I mean, this is Derrida's great objection to Hegel. He doesn't have what a modern philosopher would regard as a very sophisticated theory of language. It's a vehicle for thought. Thinking isn't, I mean, it's embodied in human language, but not in a way that has philosophical weight to it for Hegel. We've come to think differently. But I just think I have to admit that I don't think of there being in Hegel much of philosophical weight attached to the fact that thinking is linguistic. There's a kind of belief in pure concepts as moments of pure thinking self-determination that can be embodied in any language. It's much different in Heidegger, who does think language is the house of being, and they're just, completely different. But that already, in a way, it's post-Herder in the German tradition that all of this became much more pressing. And Hegel was not really influenced as much as he could have been by Herder. I don't ever find it a very interesting topic in Hegel. He's not that good on it.
So, let's thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you.